Without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Richard Bell. If you like, people that are online, you can ask questions in the Q&A or the chat feature, and that should be there for you. So thanks very much, and take it away.
All right, sounds good. Thanks so much. And if you want to mute yourself up there you go. We won't get that background noise. Perfect. Thanks, everyone. It's great to be with you live. I'm here on the East Coast at University of Maryland, and I'm going to talk to you for about, I don't know, 50 minutes or so about the role of the Irish in the American Revolution. And then I look forward to doing my best to answer any comments or questions you may have. Let me go ahead and share my slides, and then we can get started. And I think, folks, as of right now, you can see my slides, hear my voice, and see my face. And so I'm going to proceed accordingly. And let me begin by... Great, thank you. Let me begin by telling you about two Irish boys who saw action in the American Revolution. The older of the two was a lad named Roger. He was born in Dublin, the capital of Ireland, to poor Protestant parents. He enlisted in the British Army in 1773, drawn by the prospect of decent wages and maybe even a path out of poverty. He was 16 when he took the king's shilling, and he quickly realized he'd made a terrible mistake. In basic training, Roger was beaten and bullied, and then exploited by British officers who stole his wages to buy booze. Roger soon shipped out to America and saw combat as a redcoat soldier almost everywhere. He was on the field when the Continentals defeated the British at Saratoga in 1777, and then again at Yorktown in 1781. He was taken captive as a prisoner of war, not once, but twice. Both times, Roger somehow managed to escape, finding his way back to British lines. Eventually, at the end of the war, he evacuated back to Ireland. After 10 years in uniform, Roger wrote his memoirs, found a job as a schoolteacher, and then soon disappeared into the shadows of history. The other boy I want to introduce to you was named Andrew. His parents were poor Protestant emigrants to the Carolina backcountry. They were from County Antrim in the north of Ireland. Andrew's brother had served with Patriot forces and had died of heat exhaustion after the Battle of Stono Ferry in the summer of 1779. Andrew himself joined the cause soon afterwards, and he was 13 years old when he began working as a Patriot messenger. He was captured by the British at Camden in South Carolina in April 1781 and remained a prisoner of war for several months. During his captivity, the British officer in whose custody he was kept attacked the boy with a dragoon's sword for refusing to clean his boots. Andrew carried the scars from that vicious assault on his left hand and on his head for the rest of his life. And he grew up, unsurprisingly, with an intense hatred of the British and a proud, almost jingoistic belief in American superiority. He spent much of his subsequent career in the US military and then in politics. And in 1828, Andrew became the 7th president of the United States. Andrew Jackson, the first of several US presidents to have Scots-Irish ancestry, but the only former prisoner of war ever to become US president. These two Irishmen, Andrew Jackson and Roger Lamb, never met, though they had a lot in common. Their Protestantism, their Irish families, their battlefield service, and their military captivity. But they fought on different sides of the American Revolution. Roger to bring the American colonies to heel, Andrew to liberate them. And they built post-war lives in different countries on different continents. Their twinned lives remind us that Irish and Irish-American participation in the War for Independence was not monolithic or monocausal, and that despite some skin-deep similarities, America and Ireland would follow very different paths in the years after the Battle of Yorktown. On the eve of the American Revolution, Ireland was a place.
We're losing you a little bit, Richard.
Oh, really? Okay, yeah, your Wi-Fi was going in and out as well, so I'm wondering if it's on your end. Do you know that for certain that it's on my end? I can't hear you right now. I think my Wi-Fi is strong, so
Okay.
yeah, you're going in and out, Elizabeth. So
Yeah. Okay, good. We're back. It's saying I have full coverage, but we just missed a little bit there from right before this slide. You're paused again now.
Okay. Yeah, Robert says he can hear me very well, so I've got a feeling it's your Wi-Fi. So I'm going to plow on if that's okay. Yeah, you're frozen right now. Okay. So let's pick things up. On the eve of the American Revolution, Ireland was a place unlike anywhere else in the British Empire. Ireland was a fractious polity riven by a deep-seated religious divide. Roman Catholics comprised about 80% of the nearly 4 million souls living there in the 1770s, and their lot was a hard one. Excluded and alienated from almost every aspect of formal politics by legislation known as the penal laws, Ireland's Catholic majority were not only barred from landholding, but also barred from voting and from holding office. As a result, most Irish Catholics were desperately poor and typically illiterate, confined to peasant farming on acreage owned by Protestant landowners. There was, to be sure, a small Irish Catholic elite, a few thousand richer families, many of them urban dwelling, all of them literate, but their interests were so different from those of the mass of Catholic farm workers that they seemed like a community all their own. In Ireland, the Protestants ruled the roost, constituting the country's governing class. Episcopalians, that is, worshippers in the state-sanctioned Church of Ireland, filled the Irish Parliament in Dublin and dominated every aspect of the political and social system. Other Protestants, notably the many Scottish ancestored Presbyterians living in the 6 northern counties of Ireland, known as Ulster, faced watered-down versions of some of the same restrictions as Catholics. And so these other Protestants played only supporting roles in Irish politics. The King of England was the ultimate authority. Ireland had been an English imperial possession ever since the Norman invasion of 1171, a kingdom of the English monarch. In Tudor times, legislation known as Poynings Law had amplified England's domination over Ireland, rendering the Dublin legislature subordinate to the English Parliament in London, and allowing the latter to veto any piece of legislation passed by the former. In 1698, a new mandate from the London Parliament had further cemented Ireland's dependent status by requiring the permanent garrison there of a 12,000-strong cohort of British Army soldiers to be paid for by Irish taxpayers and recruited entirely from Ireland's Protestant minority population. Control over those troops and control over most other internal affairs there was largely in the hands of the Lord Lieutenant, the British King's representative in Dublin Castle. On the eve of the American Revolution, then, Ireland was a divided, sectarian, contested space. It was not really a colony, but not really its own kingdom either. Instead, Ireland was stuck somewhere in between. Ireland was England's sister, yet Ireland was also England's slave. By the time shots were fired at Lexington and Concord in April of 1775, emigration from Ireland to America had been underway for decades. Some of those emigrants were Catholic migrants, many from Ireland's southern counties, but you may be surprised to learn that the lion's share of migrants, perhaps 60%, were Protestant Presbyterians from Ulster up in the north. Waves of Ulstermen had begun to arrive in America at the end of the 1600s, driven from Ireland by famines, rack renting, and repressive restrictions on trade, and enticed to the mainland American colonies by shipping companies that promised them easier lives and lighter work. Once in America, those ships' hard-scrabble passengers fanned out, settling anywhere that land was cheap. These Irish Presbyterians, or Scots-Irish, as they rechristened themselves, pushed quickly into the forested backcountry, from Maine in the north to Georgia in the south, ignoring native claims to that land and settling where they pleased. They built townships out of the trees they cut down, and then named those new settlements Belfast, Londonderry, Donegal, Tyrone, Coleraine, and Fermanagh, after the places back home they'd left behind. By 1775, 1 in 5 white people living south of New England was of Irish origin. Approximately 400,000 Americans all told. Most were farmers of one sort or another, but the more entrepreneurial among them reinvented themselves as storekeepers, traders, merchants, and middlemen. They used their connections back in Ireland to import meat, dairy, soap, tallow, candles, linens, gloves, hats, combs, threads, and other dry goods to the colonies. That Irish-American trade grew rapidly, creating several fortunes along the way. By the early 1770s, one could find wealthy Irish-born merchants in all the principal colonial port cities. And their largesse often endowed social and philanthropic organizations like the Friendly Sons of St. Patrick of Philadelphia and the St. Patrick's Society of Charleston, both of which sprang to life in 1771. By then, by the early 1770s, ambitious and industrious Ulstermen had penetrated almost every corner of the American economy. Take, for instance, the print trades. Many colonial journalists, newspaper editors, and printers were from Irish stock, including John Dunlap. You might have heard of him. Born in County Tyrone, it was John Dunlap who printed the first news of the vote for independence in his Philadelphia newspaper, the Pennsylvania Packet, on July the 2nd, 1776. And it was also John Dunlap who printed the first 200 copies of the Declaration itself a few days later. Only about 25 of those printed declarations still survive today. Each one is worth many millions of dollars. Not bad for a kid from County Tyrone. Over the 2 years before John Dunlap printed the Declaration of Independence in Philadelphia, Irish Americans had emerged as some of the most vocal critics of Great Britain and its leaders. In the wake of the 1773 Boston Tea Party and the 1774 Coercive Acts, Scots-Irish residents of Augusta, Virginia, had sent 137 barrels of flour as food aid to anti-Parliament protesters in Massachusetts. A few months later, in May of 75, Scots-Irish settlers in Westmoreland County near Pittsburgh gathered to pen what's known today as the Westmoreland Declaration. This was an open letter in which they boldly and defiantly resolved to oppose British oppression, if necessary, with our lives. Another community of Scots-Irish Pennsylvanians, this time north of Harrisburg, made a similar public declaration on July the 4th, 1776. Because of the slow speed with which news traveled at the time, they were probably wholly unaware of the momentous events unfolding that same week in Philadelphia. There, in a building now known as Independence Hall, 9 more men of Irish ancestry, 4 of whom had been born in Ireland itself, were among those voting to approve the motion to declare independence and secede from the British Empire. Throughout the long, grinding war that resulted, Irish Americans proved themselves implacable enemies of the British Crown and resourceful and ardent supporters of independence. They were motivated by a variety of reasons: ideology, economics, peer pressure, and propaganda among them. Some Irish Americans were furious about all the new taxes enacted on the colonists since the 1765 Stamp Act, and by the occupation of Boston and the British takeover of the Massachusetts courts and legislature. Other Scots-Irish Presbyterians simply hated the Quebec Act, a loosening of anti-Catholic controls in nearby British Canada. Those Irishmen who lived in the American backcountry were surely motivated in part by fears of Native American attacks and by the prospect of gaining new acreage out west. Many flocked to patriot recruiters simply as a way to earn money or to extricate themselves from indentured servitude. So the motivations were many, but whatever they were, the sheer volume of Irish Americans who took up arms on the patriot side was astonishing. Of the 200 Continental soldiers taken prisoner by the British at the Battle of Trois-Rivières in Canada in June of 1776, at least 89 told their captors that they were Irish-born migrants to America. Likewise, at the Battle of Brandywine the following summer, prisoner of war intake registers show that the British captured 134 Irish-born patriots in a single day. The Continental Army's own records tell a similar story. One survey of its muster rolls found Irish family names everywhere. More than 200 soldiers with the last name Kelly. More than 200 more who were Murphys. The same goes for McCarthy's, Connors, O'Connors, Ryans, Rileys, Dohertys, Connollys, Sullivans, O'Briens, and Millans. To British commanders in the field, it sometimes seemed as if every Continental soldier was of Irish stock. In September of 1776, Lord Richard Howe's secretary, Ambrose Searle, reported from New York that great numbers of immigrants, particularly Irish, are in the rebel army, some by choice, and many for mere subsistence. Joseph Galloway, a loyalist officer who saw action in the Philadelphia campaign of 1777 and 1778, said much the same. He told a committee in the London Parliament that about 1/2 of the Continental fighting force was Irish. Now, before we get carried away, most historians regard those assessments as greatly exaggerated. Historians caution us not to rely on anecdotal assessments or upon counting common Irish-sounding last names in surviving muster rolls. Still, there probably were a few parts of the Continental Army in which Irish Americans might well have represented 50% of the men-at-arms. The units raised in Pennsylvania, for instance, reflected the preponderance of Scots-Irish people living there at the time. At least 7 of the companies in one battalion of Pennsylvania riflemen were composed almost exclusively of the Scots-Irish. And one Patriot commander, General Henry Lee, liked to joke that the entire Pennsylvania line might, with more propriety, have been called the Line of Ireland. Those Irish-American soldiers had been farmers, storekeepers, and servants before joining up. But they took to their new roles with enthusiasm and energy, soon becoming formidable fighters. The British general Henry Clinton told superiors in London that the immigrants from Ireland are our most serious opponents. And they proved to be particularly excellent marksmen. And many of the Patriot sharpshooters whose actions helped secure a continental victory at the Battle of King's Mountain in 1780 were Scots-Irish, the backbone of Patriot forces. Many Irish-American soldiers rose rapidly through the continental ranks, and by the end of the war, they dominated its upper echelons. Among the 26 foreign-born men appointed to the Army's most senior ranks, 16 of 26 had been born in Ireland. Among those senior officers was Richard Montgomery, an emigrant from Enniskillen in County Fermanagh, who led the continental invasion of Canada and who was killed at Quebec. There was also Anthony Wayne, born to an Anglo-Irish family that had emigrated to Pennsylvania. Wayne led continental forces at Brandywine, Germantown, Paoli, and elsewhere. There was Henry Knox, born in Boston to parents from Ulster. He became the chief artillery officer for the entire Continental Army and was one of George Washington's right-hand men. In fact, Washington surrounded himself with a great many men of Irish stock, choosing a procession of Irishmen as his aides-de-camp, among them Joseph Reed, Joseph Carey, John Fitzgerald, James McHenry, and Stephen Moylan. A handful of these Patriot officers were Irish Catholic, including John Sullivan, the son of a schoolmaster from County Kerry. But to be clear, the vast majority were Protestants, Scots-Irish. No wonder then that one Hessian captain wrote to a friend urging him, "Call it not an American rebellion. It's nothing more nor less than an Irish-Scots Presbyterian rebellion." After the war, America's Scots-Irish would reap rewards for their service to the cause of independence. With the British now gone, and their former native allies isolated, Scots-Irish settlers were in the vanguard of white migrants, pushing ever deeper into the backcountry and occupying new acreage in places like Tennessee, the state from which Andrew Jackson would ultimately launch his campaign for president. As soon as the ink was dry on the Treaty of Paris of 1783, emigration from Ireland to America resumed in earnest. 5,000 men, women, and children from Ulster arrived in 1783. 10,000 more arrived the following year. And they kept coming and coming and coming. Over the next 2 centuries, more than 5 million Irish people entered the United States. And Catholic migrants soon surpassed Protestant Presbyterians in both volume and visibility. At the height of Irish immigration to this country, in the decades either side of the American Civil War, more than 62,000 sons and daughters of Erin arrived here each year. No surprise then that to date, 15 US presidents have claimed Irish ancestry, including JFK, Ronald Reagan, Bill Clinton, Joe Biden, and even Barack Obama. That's on his mother's side, of course. As the American Revolution had unfolded, the Irish back across the ocean had followed it all very carefully, not least because the anti-crown protesters in America brought up Ireland repeatedly. At the very start of the revolutionary crisis, back in 1764, Boston's James Otis had written a pamphlet telling American colonists that Ireland was a conquered country and warning the colonists that its island's subjugation was a dark portent of what could happen in America if people here acquiesced to further extensions of British authority. And certainly the signs in the 1760s were growing ever more ominous. In 1766, British legislators enacted a declaratory act, asserting the London Parliament's absolute authority to make law for America. The text of that law was cribbed word for word from the Declaratory Act written to assert the same authority over Ireland 4 decades earlier. Colonists' pamphlets and speeches decrying the new 1766 Declaratory Act quickly made their way from America to Ireland. Activists in America also took more proactive steps to drum up Irish backing for their protests. They specifically excluded Irish-made goods from the colonial non-importation boycotts enacted after the Stamp Act and the Townshend Act. And they later dispatched Benjamin Franklin to Dublin to gauge public support. After shots were fired at Lexington and Concord, the members of the Second Continental Congress even sent an address to the people of Ireland, deploying every argument they could think of to try to drive deploying every argument they could think of to try to drive a wedge between the Irish people and the British war machine. How would the Irish respond? Excuse me. Oh, how would the Irish respond? Well, as always with Ireland, it's complicated and it depends on who in Ireland we are talking about. So let's break it down. The Protestant Episcopalian Anglo-Irish elite who dominated the country's government and politics, they generally supported the British cause in America. And they rallied to demonstrate their loyalty to the British Empire. In November of 1775, for instance, members of the Irish Parliament voted to send 4,000 troops to join the British war effort in the colonies. Ireland's contribution to the British Empire had long been in the form of soldiers designated for overseas service, and recruitment into His Majesty's armed forces was ongoing in Ireland throughout the war. At least 1 in 6 redcoats fighting to quash the rebels in America was Irish. Among redcoat officers, the ratio was 1 in 3. One of the many Irishmen to fill out those British uniforms was Roger Lamb, the boy I mentioned in my introduction. Another was a man named Richard St. George. He was the scion of a wealthy Protestant Anglo-Irish family from Galway and owned a vast estate that he rented out to dozens of Catholic tenant farmers. Richard St. George joined a British light infantry unit in 1776 when he was 24 years old and soon bought a commission as a junior officer. He was one of the 32,000 troops to arrive in New York Harbor that summer to stop the Patriot advance into that city. And over the next 12 months, he saw action at the battles of Brandywine, Paoli, and Long Island. In combat, Richard St. George was aggressive and courageous, running hell for leather at the enemy. In quieter moments, however, he was sensitive and artistic, and he drew many delicate sketches capturing his wartime experiences. At the Battle of Germantown near Philadelphia, on October the 4th, 1777, Richard St. George took an enemy musket shot to the head. He had emergency brain surgery and somehow survived. He was shipped back to Ireland to recover from his injuries, but he was haunted by hallucinations and pain for the rest of his life. Episcopalian Anglo-Irishmen like Richard St. George flocked to the officer ranks of the British Army. But among Presbyterian Ulstermen, there was no such enthusiasm. In fact, when the Dublin papers brought word in 1776 that the Patriots had penned a Declaration of Independence, many Irish Presbyterians resolved to thwart the British war effort any way they could. They urged members of the Irish Parliament to deny all requests for funding support for it, and to instead broker peace between Britain and America. Their motives for doing so, of course, were complex. Many Ulstermen surely opposed the war as a way to honour the close personal ties they had to Scots-Irish patriots in America. Many more, though, were thinking surely of their own pocketbooks. You see, the war was driving Ireland into a deep recession that was ruining livelihoods and ravaging families. Opponents of the war abhorred its disruptions to Ireland's trade with America and took umbrage when the British government imposed an embargo on that commerce in 1776 in order to reserve Irish beef and pork and butter for itself. Others worried what a British victory in America might mean for Ireland's own political prospects. Jonah Barrington, a student at Trinity College Dublin, fretted that the subjugation of America might confirm the dependence of Ireland and bring on a tidal wave of new taxes on Irish exports across the Atlantic. No surprise then that Barrington secretly hoped that the Patriots would win, believing that the loss of the colonies would give Ireland a once-in-a-century opportunity to win constitutional concessions from its weakened and humiliated British overlords. What of Ireland's large Catholic majority? Most Irishmen who saw service in America during the Revolutionary War were not officers but enlisted men, and most of them were typically Catholic, recruited from the impoverished bottom rungs of society. Catholic tenant farmers and manual labourers took the king's shilling in great numbers, especially at the outset of the war. For them, it was a matter of survival. Soldiering, however degrading, paid much better than farm work. Yet Catholic recruitment into the king's regiments was never as robust as British leaders hoped. In March of 1775, one army recruiter reported from Cork that our success will not answer His Excellency the Lord Lieutenant's expectations. And he confessed that despite a 240-person recruitment target, he'd only been able to enlist 69 new soldiers. To try to keep pace with Britain's desperate, unquenchable need for troops to send to America, he and other recruiters soon lowered the minimum required height for Irish enrollees from 5'6" down to 5'5", and increased the upper age limit from 30 years to 35. But recruitment remained sluggish. And those who did enlist often quickly deserted after pocketing their sign-up bonuses. And lethargic recruitment and frequent desertion were not the only signs that enthusiasm for the British war effort among ordinary Catholics was spotty. We know that many Catholic folk poets, writing in the Gaelic tongue, celebrated patriot victories in the war like Saratoga, and lauded generals like Washington in song. A few Irish Catholics even sent cargo ships full of aid from Cork and Limerick to their American cousins. There are unconfirmed reports of small posses of Catholic men secretly shipping themselves over there to find and enlist in the Continental Army. The entrance of the French into the American Revolutionary War in February of 1778 shook up everything, especially in Ireland. France was Britain's sworn enemy, and of course, France was a Catholic nation. Ireland's Protestant minority had long worried that the French would try to conquer their country, stir up the Catholics in Ireland in revolution, and use Ireland as a stepping stone to attack Britain itself. The French had tried just that in 1760, launching an unsuccessful invasion of Ireland during the 7 Years' War. Now that the French were allied with the Patriots against the British, they would surely try that again. So news of the French alliance with the Patriots only further depressed Irish Catholic recruitment into the ranks of the British Army. Those Irish Catholics do not want to end up in America fighting against French Catholics. So the quality of Irish Catholic enlistees into the British Army plummeted and desertions spiked. Into the breach now stepped the Ulstermen. Most had been previously opposed to the war or neutral. But when the entry of France made Ireland's own defense a matter of urgency, those Ulstermen swallowed their objections to the British war effort and pitched in to help. They began to cheer each new British victory in America and began organizing themselves into a new Homeland Security Force, a militia known as the Loyal Volunteers that could defend Ireland in the event of a French invasion. By the middle of 1780, more than 60,000 Irish Protestants, many of them Presbyterian Ulstermen, filled the ranks of the volunteers, a breathtaking show of force. At first, they professed profound loyalty to the British king. But as the war in America ground on with no end in sight, they began using their numbers and visibility to demand concessions from the British Parliament, which they held responsible for the recession now crippling the Irish economy. They began organizing demonstrations to lobby to lift the trade restrictions on Irish exports to America, and they paraded past Dublin Castle with signs hanging from cannons that read, "Free trade or speedy revolution." In homage to the colonists, the volunteers even led their own boycott of British goods and trade with Britain. In London, leaders there fretted about what to do. They were terrified that a domino effect could engulf their other imperial possessions if the Patriots won the war, and so they knew they had to handle Ireland with great care. What's more, they needed the support of the loyal volunteers in case a French invasion did ever materialize. So they had no choice but to listen. And in 1779, sent instructions to Dublin to reluctantly grant Ireland free trade. Emboldened by that victory, the volunteers now pressed for even more. They abandoned all prior protestations of loyalty and pledged next to free Ireland from English domination forever. They drew up new oaths, inviting every Irish volunteer to swear to fight to the last drop of blood for an independent Ireland, as he kissed the blade of his sword. In February of 1782, the movement's leaders met for a brief summit in Dungannon up in Ulster. They emerged, hours later, hoisting a detailed list of Irish rights and grievances. You can think of that as a declaration of independence in all but name. With Britain's troops committed in America, Britain was stretched thin. And the volunteers still had considerable clout. So just 3 months after the Dungannon Declaration in May 1782, the King's representative in Ireland, the Lord Lieutenant, the Duke of Portland, announced that he would grant one of the volunteers' central demands, the full legislative independence of the Irish Parliament. True to his word, he authorized the undoing of the 300-year-old Poynings Law and the repeal of the 1719 Irish Declaratory Act, effectively granting Ireland dominion status within the empire, semi-autonomy. In a raft of related measures, the Lord Lieutenant also enacted legal equality for Irish Presbyterians and a Catholic relief bill. It stopped short of permitting Irish Catholics any new political privileges, but it did bestow full property rights and freedom of worship. By the end of the American Revolution, the following summer, Ireland's domestic affairs and relationship with Britain had undergone an extraordinary transformation. And all so far, without mass bloodshed or civil war. The conflict in America and the entrance of Catholic France into that fight had provided the perfect conditions to achieve those ends, endowing the Irish with leverage sufficient to force authorities in London and Dublin to reward their wartime loyalty with far greater autonomy than they had had before. What I'm telling you here is that without the American Revolution, Irish free trade and Irish legislative independence might not have been possible, at least not on this accelerated timeline. As Francis Dobbs, a leader in the volunteer movement, later observed, one thing had led to another. And it was on the plains of it was on the plains of America that Ireland obtained her freedom. As soon as the war ended, the British, of course, tried to claw back some control over Ireland. With the French threat finally at bay, with troops now returning to their garrisons, the Irish volunteers quickly lost leverage after 1783, and their ranks soon began to thin as a result. Yet the after effects of the American Revolution will be felt in Ireland for decades to come. The volunteers had widened political participation in Ireland markedly. At the same time, the American war had demonstrated that Britain's hold over its imperial possessions was neither permanent nor invincible, and that when push came to shove, Britain's overstretched leaders would and could make concessions. By the 1790s, talk of an independent Ireland had returned with a vengeance. The unfolding French Revolution and Haitian Revolution and the publication of Tom Paine's Rights of Man all unleashed new energy and new passion for full sovereignty and Irish self-determination. In 1791, a new paramilitary group, comprised mostly of Catholics and Presbyterians, and calling themselves the United Irishmen, formed in Belfast. Its members committed themselves to nothing less than ending British interference in Irish affairs once and for all. Ireland's Episcopalian ruling class regarded these United Irishmen as a radical new threat to the standing order. And they were right to worry. On February 9th, 1798, a gang of poor tenant farmers, likely inspired by the United Irishmen, rose up, ambushed, and murdered Richard St. George, the Anglo-Irish gentleman who'd taken a musket ball to the head at the Battle of Germantown. To them, St. George was no hero of the British Empire, but rather a living symbol of the British oppression under which they all still labored. That was February. By May of 1798, bloody civil war for Irish independence engulfed the nation. Over the next 5 months of fighting, the United Irishmen used pikes and other makeshift weapons to try to beat the British army back into the sea. At the Battle of Arklow in County Wicklow on June 9th, 1798, the United Irishmen rushed at their British enemies under a green flag emblazoned with a cross and the slogan, "Liberty or Death." By June, the revolutionaries had succeeded in declaring the town of Wexford an independent republic, possessed of its own senate and its own army. Stung by the loss of the American colonies 15 years earlier, the British government was not about to let Ireland secede from its empire. So leaders in London dispatched Lord Cornwallis himself to Ireland to replace the Duke of Portland as Lord Lieutenant and to pacify the kingdom. Charged with preventing the loss of another British possession, Cornwallis was bent on redeeming his reputation after his surrender to the Americans at Yorktown. When Cornwallis's men arrived at Wexford, they torched thousands of cottages, executed locals, and extinguished its fledgling republic at the point of a bayonet. To identify the ringleaders of the remnant of the rebellion, Cornwallis next unleashed an army of spies. Soon enough, he'd succeeded in arresting and hanging most of the United Irishmen's top leadership and strategists. As more and more British troops massed on Ireland, Cornwallis also easily repelled the 3,000 French soldiers who landed in County Donegal in October, and then he slit the throat of Theobald Wolfe Tone, the Irish-born leader of those French invaders. Starved of allies and supplies, and lambasted by print propaganda and satires depicting them as drunks and cowards, the United Irishmen failed to persuade a critical mass of ordinary Irish to join them. Of the several million people living in Ireland in 1798, fewer than 10,000 rose with the United Irishmen that year. Historians have long been tempted to compare this Irish Revolution of 1798 with the American Revolution 2 decades earlier. To be sure, both were secession movements led by dissenters, in which the prospect of French military aid proved decisive. But upon closer inspection, the comparison quickly breaks down. In 1798, the United Irishmen were united in name only. Their leadership was soon decimated and destroyed. And there was never any entity in Ireland comparable to the Continental Congress to direct rebel strategy. In the American Revolution, the loyalist population was besieged from the beginning, but in Ireland, those loyal to the British Empire had more numbers and more power and never lost those advantages. Finally, there was the simple matter of geography. As seen from London, the American colonies were a distant speck and far less economically valuable to the empire than Caribbean sugar possessions. But Ireland was a different story. As Britain's closest neighbor, its strategic importance to the British Empire remained unrivaled. Let me wrap up. In London, news of the attempted rebellion in Ireland in 1798 prompted calls for a crackdown. Those proposals soon solidified around an Act of Union, the forced merger of the Kingdom of Ireland with the larger and more powerful Kingdom of Great Britain. An act of union would bring to an end 250 years of Ireland's existence as a separate kingdom, and would serve as a sign of the country's enduring importance to Britain and to the empire writ large. It fell to Lord Cornwallis to push the plan through the Dublin Parliament. He threatened, cajoled, and bought the votes of just enough Irish MPs who reluctantly agreed to vote their own parliament out of existence. The new plan of union became the law of the land on both sides of the Irish Sea in 1801. Thereafter, Ireland was governed by an expanded British Parliament in London. As a separate entity, Ireland no longer existed and was henceforth subsumed into a new sovereign state to be known as the United Kingdom. Accordingly, the British flag was revised to incorporate the Red Cross of St. Patrick, a galling visual reminder of the failure of Irish independence in the 18th century. The dream of a free Ireland would be deferred for an awfully long time, for more than a century more, in fact. The Act of Union binding Ireland to Great Britain survived until 1920, though the present Republic of Ireland considers 1919 to be the official year of its birth. The date, 3 years after the 1916 Easter Rising, the Irish revolutionaries issued a second Declaration of Independence from the British Empire. Inspired by the aborted revolution staged by the United Irishmen in 1798, and by the waves of decolonization movements that had decimated the great European empires since 1776, the Irish Republican Brotherhood succeeded in 1919 in completing the work that had begun long before. Leaving only the 6 counties of Ulster within the United Kingdom, they proclaimed the authority and sovereignty of a new Irish Republican government committed to providing equal rights and equal opportunity for every Irish citizen. That, I think, is where I'm going to stop. I just gave you a ton of information in far too little time. It probably felt like drinking from a fire hose. Thank you for bearing with me as I tried to cram a lot in. On this last slide, I've just got a picture of my recent book, which has nothing to do with this talk, nothing at all. But if you want to see what I've been working on until recently, check out my book, Stolen. If you'd like to get a signed copy, send me an email. But with Elizabeth's help, let's see if we can get a little bit of a conversation going in whatever time we have left. And I'm happy to run over, Elizabeth.
Thank you. Yeah, that was absolutely amazing. I have pages of notes. So while we wait for people to, oh good, somebody's already asked a question. That's what I was going to say. I'll ask, the questions if you pop them into the chat or the Q&A. So Robert asks, why was there not a violent civil war in Ireland between the 20% Protestants versus the 80% Catholic majority?
Yeah, it's a great question. I know Robert. Robert's a friend of mine. He always asks smart questions. Yes, it's a great question, right? Because the numbers would suggest that that disproportional power imbalance in which a 20% minority population controls the fates of an 80% majority population would be deeply unstable. And I think you could argue that, yes, it certainly was deeply unstable. And so the British government, which represents the interests of that 20% Protestant minority, pours a lot of manpower, time, and energy and legislative work into creating a superstructure and surveillance state designed to keep Catholics poor and powerless and downtrodden. The Protestant British majority's stance to their Catholic neighbors is a complete lack of sympathy for their economic circumstances, a deep-seated suspicion of their religious faith. You know, Protestants, especially living in that place at that time, regarded Catholics as backward heretics, of course. And so it was that set of cultural assumptions of inferiority, of Catholics being less than, that informed a barrage of legislation, both in London and Dublin, to ghettoize the poor Irish population, and a military presence in Ireland funded from Protestant taxpayers to keep dissenting uppity Catholics in line wherever possible. So what I'm saying here is that without that legislation designed to marginalize the Catholic population, without that military presence designed to terrorize that Catholic population, then there would have been much more contest, that you would see a smoldering civil war. And in fact, you know, many scholars of Ireland would tell you that despite all that attempt at suppression and oppression, there is plenty of resistance. You might not call it a civil war, but there's plenty of dissent, protest, and resistance to being treated like, you know, crap for 300 years. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's interesting you touched on in your talk too how disparate the United Irishmen even were. You know, I hadn't really thought of that before, that obviously it was a very short-lived rebellion, you know, but there isn't the equivalent of a continental congress, and it was very easily infiltrated by spies. So the fact that that movement isn't coherent in itself, you know, is kind of detrimental to the cause too. And 1803 is even shorter, you know.
Yeah, just quickly on that. I think that's exactly right, Elizabeth. Yeah. So the United Irishmen, you know, do have some deficiencies of organization and leadership, and that's on them. But simultaneously, they are under close surveillance by a British state, which is on high alert after losing 13 colonies, for any other colonies to follow down the same path. So the British superstate is much more vigilant to nip that sort of stuff in the bud than it was in 1770 in North America, right? So they learn a lesson about nipping things in the bud and squashing things quickly, which don't allow the United Irishmen to fix their, you know, their infrastructure problems, right? They're not given time to germinate as a resistance movement.
Yeah, that's exactly. Lawrence asks a fabulous question. How did Presbyterian theology contribute to the predilection of Scots-Irish to side with the Continentals in the American Revolution? I think that whole Presbyterian theology, you know, and how it plays out in America is fascinating.
Yeah, I don't have a good answer to that, Lawrence, for a couple of reasons. You know, one is that I'm not a sophisticated theologian or scholar of religion myself, and because I think my reading of the secondary scholarship on this, which is quite large, by the way, hasn't reached the other historians who know more about this than me have not reached a consensus view about how important the peculiarities of different Protestant denominations are to political behavior in this period. So I am generally more sympathetic, and maybe this comes from my own lack of faith in any Christian framework. I'm generally more sympathetic to the idea that religious identities shape economic circumstances in the 18th century, and that it's economic circumstances which often inform political ideology, so that there's a degree of remove and distance between theology and political ideology, and what's in between that is economic circumstance. So I think the fact that Many Scots, Irish Presbyterians arriving in America are eager for land out west because they've not been accepted by other Protestants on the East Coast who see them as weird and different to their own sort of Anglican or congregational background, means that they're economically marginalized in Appalachia. And it's that appetite for cheap land out west that makes them naturally eager to get the British government out of colonial America, because as every historian will tell you, it's the British government in London trying to enforce the proclamation line to stop white settlers pushing even further west onto native land. And so if we can remove that British obstruction, then taking possession of native land will get easier. Many poor farmers in Appalachia believe. So again, I tend to think that economic circumstance is what drives political decision making most directly, but I can't discount the importance of theology. I'm just saying I'm not smart enough to understand it.
Mhm. No, I think that's right. I was really struck by your numbers, that the 1 in 6, of the redcoats were Irish, and then 1 in 3 of the officer class. So naturally, you would imagine a lot of the enlisted men or press ganged men defect once they come to America. Yeah. Do you have figures on that, or do they even get as far as America? Do they? You were saying, they take the king's shilling and then left, but are they sent here and go to the other side, or what happens?
Yeah, so that's exactly right. So the numbers of Irish enlistees in the British Army are mind-bogglingly large, which has long been the case, by the way. Or as I said, that Ireland's commitment to the British Empire was often in the form of enlisting soldiers for overseas service. There's nothing terribly new about that in the American Revolutionary era. If you look at the last war, the French and Indian War, the 7 Years' War, you see the same preponderance of Irish soldiers in redcoat uniforms. You'll see the same in the next one, the Napoleonic Wars against France as well. This is just the way it is at that time. But given that many Irish recruits into the British Army are doing it for economic reasons rather than for any commitment to the British cause, given that some of them are Catholic and France will ultimately join the Patriot side and they don't want to go to America and fight Catholics, the incentives to desert in this war for Irish soldiers in British uniform are particularly elevated or accentuated here. So we see wave after wave of defections by Irishmen from the British Army, not necessarily into the Patriot Army, but out of the British Army, right? Desertion is the word I'm looking for. Desertion. And so we do have rough numbers on that, but of course, we can't put too much weight on them. If you just go around counting desertion ads in newspapers, you're going to get a very imperfect count, but you'll see it's a lot, right? They're publishing desertion ads in Ireland where newspapers do not penetrate terribly well, and in the colonies. So what I'm saying to you is they desert in Ireland before they get to America, and more desert in America having left Ireland, usually with the notion that they'll settle in America like that. So yeah, desertions are massive. Defections from one army to the other, much more modest, I think. Again, suggesting economic circumstances rather than ideology being the driving force.
Absolutely, yeah. Richard asks, was Washington troops at Valley Forge more Irish or Irish Scots than American born?
Oh, yeah, I think that would probably be skirting the realms of what's likely here. Because remember, Washington's army at Valley Forge, which ultimately grows to about 20,000 people if you include all the camp followers as well, is coming from each of the different rebel colonies. So if we just counted Pennsylvanians, then yeah, probably it would be more than half. But if you bring in the New England colonies, your Massachusetts, your Connecticut, for instance, they have far fewer Irish migrants in their civilian population before the war than Pennsylvania or any of the of Georgia or North Carolina. So when I gave a statistic in the talk, I said that 1 in 5 white people south of New England was of Irish stock, approximately 400,000. So note the phrase south of New England there, right? So I'm saying in the New England colonies, there aren't as many Irish migrants. And we know that early in the war, especially, the New England colonies are very well represented in the Continental Army. Think of all the Massachusetts regiments, the Connecticut regiments. So I think they dilute the proportion of Irish Americans in the Continental Army as a whole. So I think 50% is high, but I do think 30% or a third is probably roughly accurate. And that's huge, right? Don't downplay a third. If a third of the army are Irish American migrants, my God, what must that say about Britain's control over Ireland at that time? Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. So Jack, to expand on that, says, do you know the number of Irish in the Patriot ranks totally?
So we don't have firm and accurate numbers, but let me just go over some basics here. The Continental Army, which is the so-called professionals, right? Not the militias, not the part-timers, but the full-timers, usually is around 20,000 persons strong, though it dips as low as 5,000 at one point and rises as high as 30,000 at another point. So on average, you might say it's around 15 to 20,000 people, but there's huge amounts of turnover within those numbers, right? It's not the same guys the whole time. We think that by war's end in 1783, Jack, approximately 200,000 men and boys have cycled through the Continental Army and the state militias combined. So that's a massive number. And again, notice the phrase "we think," right? That suggests a degree of estimation there. So I'm going to stand by what I just said before, that in the broadest possible terms, we think about a third, about 30 to 40% of Patriot forces were of Irish background. But we're not going to be able to narrow that down to 35.731 or a hard number you can take to the bank, right? Because tracking this stuff for an army that is highly improvised, that is being made from scratch in 1775 and does not have a good, strong track record of record keeping or bureaucracy is impossible in this period. The British Army is easier because they're an established army that's been counting stuff and moving paper for hundreds of years. The Continental Army didn't exist before 1775, so they're making it up as they go along, and record keeping is not their top priority.
It's a huge turnover, 20,000 to 200,000. Robert has another fascinating question. You mentioned that Ulstermen and Catholics, or Catholics, I guess, decided to help the British to fight against French Catholics in America.
You broke up halfway through that. Can you do that again?
Oh, sorry. The fact that they had decided to support the French Catholics was one thing, but did they decide to support Spanish Catholics in America too? The Irish.
Robert, yeah, I see what you mean. Yeah. So Robert's probably heard my talks on the French role in the war and the Spanish role in the war, and he knows that I think that the entrance of France and Spain matter a great deal. You got a little glimpse of that today in this Irish talk, because the entrance of Catholic France changes the religious dynamics of Irish engagement in the war, right? We see Irish Protestants suddenly get very motivated to fight their enemy because now their enemy is full of Catholics from France. And we see Irish Catholics become even less motivated than they already were to fight Britain's war, because now they could be sent to fight against fellow Catholics who are from France. Spain is also a Catholic nation, which is why Robert's asking this question. Spain joins the war in 1779. So on paper, you would expect the same dynamics to recur, right? A year later when Spain enters the war. I don't think that's quite as tangible, actually, when Spain enters the war as it is when France enters the war, for the simple reason that most Spanish soldiers, and sailors um, will be sent to theaters of war that are not in North America. The Spanish engagement with the British Armed Forces is in Central America. It's in the Mediterranean. It's along the Gulf coast, which means there's much less um, uh, debate in the newspapers about the threat of a Catholic threat emanating from Spain. But I guess where you would see this, Robert, would be in the Navy, right? To the extent that Irishmen are being press ganged into the Royal Navy or volunteering to join the Royal Navy, then it's the Royal Navy which is seeing a lot of direct engagement with the Spanish Navy. So maybe that would be the place to look for evidence for Robert's theory, or maybe people are already on high alert about the Catholic threat because France is already there, and so Spain just feels like more of the same, right? That it's hard to get angry and worried a second time when you're already angry and worried from the first time, if that makes any sense.
Mm-hmm. Lawrence says this is a little bit beyond the scope of your talk, Professor Bell, but how big of a role did the Scots-Irish, aside from figures like Andrew Jackson, play in American politics in the early 19th century of American politics?
Yeah, that is beyond the scope of my expertise as well, Lawrence. So I'll keep this very brief as well. My sense is that, yeah, the Scots Irish, who of course they're called the Scots Irish because these Irish Presbyterians were originally Scottish migrants to Northern Ireland, often sent on missionary sort of missions in the early 1600s. They continue to play a major role in American politics up through at least the Civil War. Because when we think of Irishmen in America before the Civil War, we're largely thinking about these Scots-Irish Presbyterians who've been there since the mid 1700s. Many have become quite wealthy. I mentioned merchants and traders founding philanthropies and stuff like that. They've developed a reputation as hardy farmers out in Appalachia and as canny businessmen in urban areas, and that's translated into political power. So we see in, for instance, Pennsylvania politics, different ethnic factions developing in the late 18th and early 19th century, which include, old line Quakers, but also German migrants and also Scots-Irish migrants, all competing with one another for political supremacy in state politics. But I do, and I think that culminates with the rise of Andrew Jackson in the 1820s, right? Who develops a base of people like him from Scots-Irish backgrounds. But I would say by the 1840s and onwards, the political impact and power of Scots-Irish Americans is waning somewhat because it's being eclipsed by a rising wave of Irish Catholic migrants to America, most of whom come here incredibly poor, of course, as a result of the Irish famine and other economic circumstances. But their numbers are enormous. And so they come to numerically displace and replace the Scots-Irish Presbyterians in the American imagination. So that by 1850, when white Americans of English stock think of Irishmen in America, they're no longer thinking of Scots-Irishmen like Andrew Jackson. They're thinking of Irish Catholics who've come in the last 10 years, and they're getting all, they're getting very anxious and nervous that Irish Catholics are bringing with them poverty and crime and Catholic superstition and things like that, which were valences not normally applied to the Scots-Irish a previous generation ago, in part because they were Protestants and weren't seen as the same sort of heretical threat.
Uh-huh. Well, and that's exactly why, the American Irish Historical Society was founded in the 1890s to kind of redress that balance and to bring back in the more hoi polloi and the elite of Irish America who had been Scottish, or Protestant at least. So yeah. So look, I think we'll leave it there. We've been on for a long time, but it was an absolutely fascinating, as you said, jam-packed talk, and I really appreciate it. Oh, hang on, we've got one more, maybe a comment. Again, Lauren says, thank you so much for your thoughtful and thorough answer. So he appreciated your other answer too. So thank you all for joining. Thank you, Dr. Bell, for coming on. I think it was absolutely fascinating. We'll have to have you back. I'm just going to quickly announce on the 27th next week, we're back with Gerard Shannon, who's going to talk to us about Liam Lynch and the War of Independence, which you touched on. He was a kind of a forgotten hero or controversial figure in Irish history. So we'll talk about him next week at 6 o'clock on the 27th. But thank you very much, and lovely to see all of you on here tonight. And we'll be back with the full program on in September and October. Kathy says, thanks so much. It was a great presentation. Yeah, thank you. Thanks, everyone.